Hello, and welcome back to Void Whispers. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from. I love reading every single one. If you enjoy the Void Whispers that creep in during the dead of night, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, get comfortable, dim the lights if you dare, relax your mind, let the outside world fade away. And let's begin. Story 1. I run a paranormal blog. Yeah, I know. I started it after my ex-husband died. I needed somewhere to put all the noise in my head, I guess. And it helped. Mostly I debunk things. I try to give people closure. It does not always work, but I try. In my experience, most ghosts are just bad pipes. Demons are usually raccoons or whatever animal got into somebody's attic and started making noises in the middle of the night. So when people started messaging me about Lucent Lake, I did not immediately pack a bag. The rumors were about a killer, a slasher or something lurking out there in the woods near the water. That kind of thing did not raise any red flags for me because I had heard it all before. Every small town has a lake or a forest or an abandoned building where somebody swears something terrible lives. It is almost never true. But then people started sending me screenshots from local Facebook groups and sad, angry posts from relatives and friends. 4 people had died in 3 weeks. 4 real people, with names and families and lives that just ended without any explanation. Something felt off about the whole thing, so I guess I took the hook. Nobody had seen anyone or anything near the victims. There were no footprints around the bodies. No weapon was ever found. No suspect was ever identified. The police kept telling the news cameras that it might be an animal attack, but you could feel that nobody really believed that. They were just saying words into microphones so people in the area would not completely lose their minds and panic. Lucent Lake is a nice place under normal circumstances. Picnic tables scattered around the shore, trails winding through the trees, teenagers hiding beer in their backpacks behind the restrooms, couples posing for photos on the old dock like it was not half-rotted and ready to collapse under their weight. It was a normal place, safe enough for families and hikers and anyone looking for a quiet afternoon by the water. When I got there, the place was completely empty. The woods felt abandoned in a way that went beyond just being closed off. It felt like even the animals had decided to leave. I got there after dark. Yeah, I know. But I knew the area from years ago, and I could not exactly tell my boss that I needed to leave work early because people on the internet were saying there was an invisible slasher killing folks by a lake. That is not a conversation that ends well for anyone. And if I am being honest with myself, I knew showing up at night would be good for the blog. Night footage at a place where people died. That is the kind of content that gets clicks. I am not proud of that thought, but it was there. The road leading to the lake was narrow and annoying. Every branch that caught my headlights looked like a hand reaching out from the trees. Every shadow on the side of the road looked like a person standing there watching me pass. I kept telling myself to knock it off. I actually said it out loud. Great live. Very professional. Pulitzer stuff. About a mile from the lake, there was this half-assed barricade stretched across the road. Just some orange cones and a metal barrier that looked like it had been dragged out of a storage shed and dropped in the middle of the pavement without much thought. 2 rangers stood next to the barricade. At least they were dressed like rangers. The man came over to my car first. He was an older guy with a gray beard and a big jacket, and he was already looking disappointed in me before I had even rolled down my window. He had that energy that certain men have when they have spent their whole career dealing with people who do not listen. I immediately thought of him as Park Dad because that is exactly what he looked like. Park Dad leaned toward my window and told me the road was closed. I said, "Yeah, I saw that." He said, "Then turn around." I told him I was hoping to just take a look at the area. And he said, "No. Just no. Nothing else. No explanation. No negotiation. Just no." I said, "Okay, warm guy." He did not love that. The woman ranger came over then. She was maybe my age or maybe a little younger. It was hard to tell in the harsh white light of a flashlight. She looked tired, but not the kind of tired you get from missing sleep. She looked tired in the way people look when they have been polite for far too long and they are running out of patience for it. She looked at me for a moment, and then her eyes widened just a little. She asked me if I was Liv from Grave Doubts. That is the name of my blog. I smiled because it is always nice when someone recognizes you, even if the circumstances are terrible. Park Dad said doubts or no doubts, you need to leave right now. The woman ignored him completely and told me that I could not go in there tonight. I said I was not trying to be a problem. Park Dad said I was literally a problem. That was fair, honestly. The woman lowered her flashlight so it was not shining directly in my eyes anymore, which I appreciated. She told me that people were dead. She said the sheriff had personally asked them to close this road and that they did not know what had killed those people. She said it could be a person, or it could be an animal, or it could be some idiot with a machete hiding somewhere out in those woods. They just did not know. I said a bear does not usually use a machete. Park Dad stared at me with the kind of look that could curdle milk. The woman looked at me for a long second, and then she asked me something I was not expecting. She asked me if I was scared. I almost answered honestly. Yes. Obviously, yes. I was scared. Of course I was scared. But scared does not mean what most people think it means. Scared does not always make you turn around and run in the other direction. Sometimes scared makes you very, very focused. Sometimes fear sharpens everything, and you see more clearly than you ever do when you feel safe. So I shrugged and said, "I do this kind of thing." She told me that was not really an answer. I said no, it was not. She sighed and said, "Please just go home." That almost worked. It really did, because she said it like a person who was genuinely concerned about me and not like someone giving an order. There was real worry in her voice, and that is always harder to brush off than authority. But I could not just go home. I was going to be gone for a whole week after tonight for a work trip, so this was my only chance. Tonight was it. So I turned my car around like a normal, responsible adult. I even gave them a polite little wave as I drove away from the barricade. Then I drove about half a mile back down the road and parked in a muddy little clearing off to the side. I turned off my headlights and sat there for a minute in the dark. Then I got out of the car and walked into the trees. Yes, I understand how incredibly stupid that was. I understood it at the time, too. Every step I took into those dark woods, I was fully aware that this was the kind of decision that gets people killed in exactly the kind of stories I write about on my blog. But I felt like I had no choice. Something was pulling me toward that lake. And it was not just curiosity or content for the blog. I had my phone and my flashlight and my camera and a can of pepper spray and that little cloth pouch tucked into the inside pocket of my jacket. To be honest, that pouch was the real reason I was there. Lucent Lake was not random for me. It was not just some location I picked because strangers on the internet sent me messages about it. I had been there before, years ago, with Daniel. Daniel was my husband, my ex-husband. Daniel is dead now. People always get very soft when I say that. They do the face. You know the one? The "oh, you poor thing" face where their eyebrows go up and their voice drops half an octave and they reach out to touch your arm like you might break. I hate that face. The truth is, when Daniel died, grief was not the first thing I felt. The first thing I felt was relief. Pure, clean, overwhelming relief, like someone had finally lifted a weight off my chest that I had been carrying for so long I forgot what breathing without it felt like. I am not going to give you a list of what he did or did not do. I hate it when people want specific examples, like they are qualified to be the judge of someone else's pain. Like whether or not I am allowed to hate him depends on whether the details are bad enough to meet their personal threshold for what counts as real suffering. I will say this much. My kids knew the sound of his car. They knew the exact sound of his engine and the way his tires crunched on the gravel in the driveway. The second they heard him pulling in, the whole house stopped breathing. Not just them. The whole house. The air itself changed when he came home. And leaving him did not fix anything. Most people love saying, "at least you got out," like that is the end of the story. Like sick and dangerous men respect things like locks and court orders and changed phone numbers and school pickup schedules. Like once you file the papers and move to a new address, the nightmare is over and you can start fresh. Daniel did not respect any of it, of course. He kept calling. He kept waiting outside places he knew I would be. He kept showing up at the house and finding reasons to be there. He found ways around every boundary I set and every protection I tried to put in place. He made sure that my kids and I understood that being out was not the same thing as being free. I could not do it anymore. I could not keep living like that. Every window in my house was a potential threat. Every phone call made my heart stop. Every car that slowed down near the house made me grab for my phone and check if the doors were locked. It was enough. I had reached the end of what I could endure. So I went to see a woman that a friend of mine knew. She lived above a dentist office in this little building downtown. She wore sweatpants, and her apartment smelled like something I could not identify. She made me tea that was terrible, and I was not completely sure it was just tea. She listened to everything I told her. She listened for a long time without interrupting. Then she said I needed closure. I told her what I actually wanted. I said I wanted him to get what he deserved, and I wanted him out of my life and out of my kids' lives for good. She looked at me with these calm, steady eyes and said, "Those are not always the same thing." I remember that very clearly because it made me angry at the time. She said, "If it is closure, then it closes. If it is not, then it just keeps bleeding." I remember thinking, "Lady, I have 2 kids and a man who will not stop circling my life like a shark. I do not have time for fortune cookie philosophy." So I just said it plain. "I want him gone." She gave me a small cloth pouch filled with this strange-smelling white powder, and she told me specific words to say. She explained how to use it and what to expect, and she looked at me very seriously when she said it. A week later, Daniel drove his car into a tree during a rainstorm. He hit it so hard and so fast that they had to identify him by his dental records. Coincidence, maybe. I told myself it was a coincidence for a whole year. Some nights I almost believed it. But now I had this feeling about Lucent Lake. A feeling I could not shake. A feeling that told me whatever was happening out there by that water was connected to me in ways I did not want to think about too carefully. So I went. The trail through the woods was dark, but not weird. It was just woods, leaves and mud and branches catching on my sleeves as I pushed through. I moved slowly because I kept my flashlight off most of the time. The last thing I needed was for one of the rangers to spot a light moving through the trees and come drag me back to my car again. Then I heard my name. Not a whisper exactly, just very quiet. Quiet enough that for a second I genuinely thought I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the wind moving through the branches in a way that sounded like a word. Maybe my tired brain was playing tricks on me in the dark. Then it came again. Live. I stopped walking. Everything in me went still. It sounded like his voice. It sounded exactly like Daniel. My first thought was very stupid. My first thought was no, thank you. Like I could just opt out. Like I could unsubscribe from whatever this was and go back to my car and drive home and pretend I never heard it. Live. My hand closed around the pouch in my jacket pocket. I could feel the powder through the thin cloth, and I held on to it, like it was the only thing keeping me from falling apart. Then someone grabbed my arm. I made a noise that I will not be describing here because I have some pride left, and I would like to keep it. It was Park Dad. He was standing right there on the trail behind me, and he had my arm in his grip, and he looked furious. He asked me if I was serious. I told him not to grab me. He said, "Then do not sneak past a roadblock." I said, "I was just leaving." He said I was literally walking toward the lake. I said, "I got turned around." He just looked at me with that look again. "Fine," I said. "Bad lie." He pulled out his radio and spoke into it. "Found her. South Trail?" "Yeah. I have got her." Then he looked at me again, and his voice dropped a little. He told me that this was not some stupid internet thing. He asked me if I understood that. I said I knew. He said he did not think I did. He said people were dead. I said I know. And I did know. Better than he did, probably. He still had his hand on my sleeve. Then his expression changed. It was not fear. Not exactly. It was confusion. Like something had happened that his brain could not process fast enough. He looked down at his own chest. His jacket open. I do not mean he unzipped it. I mean it open on its own. The fabric parted like something invisible had cut through it. A red line appeared across his chest, and then blood hit my face. Way too much of it. Hot and wet and smelling like copper, and it was everywhere. On my face, and my hands, and my jacket. He made this small sound, not a scream. More like a sound of embarrassment. Like he was sorry for the inconvenience of what was happening to him. Another cut opened under his jaw. A deep one. I could see the inside of him for a moment, and then the blood came pouring out. I stepped back. My feet slipped in the mud, and I almost fell. He reached toward me. Maybe he was reaching for help. Maybe it was just reflex. People do strange things when they are dying. Their bodies move on their own, even when their minds have already checked out. Then his face came apart. That is the only way I can describe it. It just opened up, and there was nothing underneath that should have been there. There was nothing around him. No bear, no man, no shape in the air, no shadow, nothing visible at all. Just invisible force, tearing a person apart in front of me like he was made of paper. Park Dad dropped to the ground, and his flashlight rolled off into the wet leaves. The beam spun in a lazy circle, and then settled, pointing at nothing. I ran. Not away from the lake, though. I know. Believe me, I know how that sounds. I should have run back to my car. I should have run to the road. I should have run anywhere that was not deeper into the woods toward the place where people had been dying. But Daniel's voice came again from somewhere ahead of me, near the water. And in that moment, it made a kind of terrible sense. The voice was pulling me forward, and I let it because I understood something in that moment that I could not put into words yet. I did not want to leave what was left of Park Dad lying there in the mud. He deserved better than that. But I could not stay either. That was Daniel all over when I thought about it. Hurt someone else and somehow make it my problem. Make it my fault. Make me carry it. I reached the lake out of breath and spitting someone else's blood out of my mouth. The taste was making me gag, but I could not stop to deal with it. The water was black. Perfectly black and perfectly still, like a sheet of dark glass. The old dock was still there, and still half collapsed, just like I remembered it from years ago. Nothing about this place had changed except for everything about how it felt. He was standing in the water, right where the lake met the muddy shore. Daniel. Or something that looked exactly like Daniel. He did not look like a person anymore, though. Not really. His clothes were wet and dark and clinging to his body. His face seemed intact at first glance, but his skin looked wrong. It had this quality to it like wax that had been slightly melted and then hardened again in a shape that was close to right, but not quite. His head was tilted slightly to one side like he was listening to something far away that only he could hear. But it was him. I knew it was him the way you know someone by the way they stand in a room, by the space they take up, by the feeling they create in your chest when you see them. I felt chills prickling all over my body when I saw that smile, that stupid, patient smile, the one he used to wear at home when he knew everyone in the house was afraid of what he might do next. The smile that said, "I have all the time in the world, and you have none." I pulled the pouch out of my pocket. My fingers were shaking so badly that I almost dropped it in the mud. I fumbled with the string that held it closed and tried to get my hands to cooperate. He stepped toward me, one slow step through the shallow water. I told him to stay there. My voice cracked when I said it. He did not stay there. Of course he did not. Daniel never stayed where you told him to stay. Daniel never stopped when you asked him to stop. That was the whole point of Daniel. I thought of Donnie and Ben, my kids, but not in some soft, glowing, cinematic way. Not in a way that would look good in a movie. I thought of the real things, the ugly, true things. I thought about how long it took them to make noise in the house after he died. Months of quiet, careful children, tiptoeing through rooms like they were afraid to be heard. I thought about how fast they still say sorry. For everything. For nothing. Sorry is the first word out of their mouths in any situation because that is what he taught them. I thought about how Donnie still watches doors when people argue. He does not look at the people fighting. He watches the door. He is always calculating how fast he can get out. Daniel kept coming toward me. I screamed at him, "Why are you here? Why are you back? Get away from me, Daniel. Get the fuck away from me." I untied the pouch with my teeth because my fingers would not do it. I bit down on the string and pulled, and the knot came loose. And the powder was right there in my trembling hand. That was when he slowed down. Then he stopped. He was close now. Close enough that I could see the water dripping from his jaw and the way his eyes were not quite focused on anything real. He muttered something. I heard the words, but I did not understand them. Or maybe I did not want to understand them. Either way, I did not let myself process whatever he said. I threw the powder in his face and said the words the woman had given me. I said them loud and clear, even though my voice was shaking and my whole body was trembling. Nothing happened. For one horrible moment, I stood there thinking this was it. This thing that looked like Daniel was going to kill me right here by this lake. Tomorrow I would be a sad little post on social media that people scrolled past during their lunch break. Another name. Another tragedy that strangers skimmed over and then forgot about. Then Daniel folded inward. I do not know how else to describe it. He collapsed into himself like a building imploding in slow motion. His shoulders caved in first. Then his face started sinking like something was pulling it from the inside. His mouth was open, but no sound came out. His whole body shrank and compressed into this dark, wet lump in the water. Then even that thinned out and spread across the surface like an oily stain floating there on the black water. And then it was gone. Just ripples where he had been standing, and then not even that. I stood there for a long time. I did not want to move, or maybe I could not move. I was not sure which one it was. I did not feel relief. Not yet. Maybe I was still in shock. Maybe relief does not come that fast when the thing you have been afraid of for years finally disappears in front of your eyes. The lake was quiet. No splashing, no whispering, no voice calling my name. Just the water and the trees and the cold night air. I actually said, okay, out loud. Just okay. Like I had finished paying a bill or completing some mundane errand. Like what had just happened was a normal thing that normal people dealt with on Tuesday nights. Then I had this sudden, overwhelming urge to just go home. Not slowly, not carefully. Just go home right now as fast as possible and be in my house with the door locked and the lights on. Then I heard crying. Coming from the trees behind me. The woman ranger came through the branches with her gun drawn. Both her hands were shaking so badly I could see the gun trembling from where I stood. She asked me where Tom was. That must have been Park Dad's real name. I raised my hand so she could see them. I told her not to shoot. She asked me again where he was. I said, I was sorry. She said, what? Where is he? I told her he was dead. She looked at the blood covering me. My face, my hands, my jacket. She asked me what I had done. I told her I did not do it. I said, listen, there was something here, and I stopped it. I think I stopped it. She said, you think? I said, I know. I know how that sounds. I know how all of this looks. I am covered in your partner's blood and telling you that an invisible monster killed him, and I just defeated my dead ex-husband's ghost with magic powder. I know. She told me to get on my knees. I said, okay. I started to kneel down in the mud. Then she flinched. Her whole body jerked to one side like something had hit her. A cut opened on her cheek, a thin red line that appeared out of nowhere and started bleeding immediately. I froze. Another cut opened across her jacket. Longer this time, deeper. The fabric split apart, and blood started seeping through. I said no, just no. Like saying it would make it stop. She looked at me, not behind her, not into the trees, not at the sky. She looked directly at me, right into my eyes, and I saw something in her face that I will never forget. It was not fear. It was not confusion. It was understanding. She understood in that last second that there was nothing she could do. Then her throat opened. A line appeared across it, and the blood came, and she dropped into the leaves without making another sound. The forest went quiet again. That same heavy, terrible silence. I got up and I ran. I ran like hell. I did not look back. Not once. I think I fell several times on the trail because my hands and knees were scraped and bleeding when I finally got back to my car, but I do not actually remember falling. I just remember running and the branches hitting my face and the sound of my own breathing. And then somehow I was at my car. I got in and I drove. I drove like a maniac until I hit the main road back to town. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white, and my whole body was still shaking. Then I got this weird feeling, chills starting at my forehead and rolling down over my shoulders and all the way down my spine, like cold water being poured over me very slowly. I do not know why, but in that moment, I remembered what the powder woman had told me all those years ago. If it is not closure, it keeps bleeding. And sitting there in my car, driving too fast down a dark road covered in blood that was not mine, I finally understood what she meant. I realized that this thing out there, this invisible thing that was killing people, it was not random. It was not some creature that lived in the woods. It was not a bear or a maniac with a machete. It was mine. It belonged to me. It was the opposite of closure. It was everything I had not dealt with, everything I had not faced, everything I had shoved down and locked away and refused to look at. It had dragged me back to Lucent Lake because it knew I would come. It knew I was not going there to forgive Daniel or to let go of what happened or to find peace or any of that clean, pretty bullshit that people say when they have never had to live through what I lived through, when they have never had to watch their children flinch at the sound of a car door closing, when they have never had to explain to a 7-year-old why Daddy is not allowed to come inside anymore. And I knew I was right about all of this because the second I thought it, I felt something. Not fear, something else. Something like recognition. Like a connection between me and this thing that I could feel in my chest. I knew it would not hurt me. Not me. Never me. I am home now. I desperately need a shower. The blood is dried on my skin and it feels tight and cracked and wrong. It is 3 a.m. My kids are at my sister's house. I lied to my sister and told her my flight was tonight and that I needed to drop them off early. She did not ask questions. She never does. She is good like that. It is here with me. In my house. I know it is. I cannot see it. I cannot hear it. But I can feel it the way you feel someone watching you from across a room. That prickling sensation on the back of your neck, that weight in the air that tells you that you are not alone. There are scratches on the inside of my front door, long, deep scratches in the wood that were not there before I left tonight, like something was trying to get out, or trying to keep something else from getting in. And that is the part I cannot handle. Not that it followed me home. I expected that on some level. I think I knew the moment I threw that powder that this was not over. The part I cannot handle is that it thinks it is helping. It thinks it is protecting me. It killed those people at the lake because they were near the place where I sent Daniel away. It killed Park Dad because he grabbed my arm. It killed the woman ranger because she pointed a gun at me and told me to get on my knees. In its mind, or whatever passes for a mind in something like this, it was keeping me safe. Just like I wanted. Just like I asked for. I wanted him gone, and something made him gone, and now that something is still here doing what it thinks I want. Then someone screamed outside. A real scream. Short and wet and cut off way too fast. The kind of scream that stops not because the person stopped screaming, but because they could not scream anymore. It sounded like Jerry, the old bastard who lives next door, the one who watches me from his porch whenever I am sunbathing in the yard, the one who stares a little too long and does not look away when I catch him. The one who sprays neighborhood kids with his garden hose if they step 1 foot too close to his precious grass. Oh, fuck. Story 2. I remember playing a game back in the 80s called The Orchard on the Atari 2600. I do not really remember much about it. It was not a great game. And I was only about 6 years old when I played it. Over time, I basically forgot it ever existed. It just disappeared from my memory the way most things from early childhood do. You move on, you grow up, you fill your head with 1,000 other experiences, and something like a mediocre Atari game from when you were barely old enough to read just fades away into nothing. Until I found it mentioned in an old article. I was browsing the internet late one night, the way you do when you cannot sleep and you have nothing better to do, and I came across this piece someone had written about long-forgotten video games. It was a list of obscure titles that had come and gone without leaving much of a trace, games that most people had never heard of and that history had more or less erased. I was scrolling through it casually, not really paying attention, when I saw the name, The Orchard, and something in the back of my brain lit up. I knew that name. I had played that game. The memory came back in a rush, not the details. Just the feeling of it sitting on the floor of my parents' living room with the controller in my hands and the television glowing in front of me. The article said the game was released in 1982 by a company that no longer exists. I will not name them here because, honestly, I am not sure it matters. And something about this whole situation makes me want to be careful about what I share. The game had really simple graphics, even by the standards of the early 80s, and the mechanics were repetitive and boring. You controlled a little farmer character in a huge forest, and your job was to collect apples while dodging birds that flew at you from different directions. That was it. That was the entire game. Collect apples, avoid birds, repeat. There was no real progression, no levels that felt meaningfully different from one another, no ending as far as anyone could tell, just the same basic loop over and over again. But the article did not stop there. It went on to describe something that made me sit up straighter in my chair and read much more carefully. Apparently, multiple people who had played the game reported seeing strange things. Not glitches, not the kind of visual artifacts you sometimes got from old cartridges with dirty connectors. These were specific, detailed things that should not have been possible on the hardware. People described seeing abandoned houses appear in the forest. Some saw dead people, figures lying on the ground between the trees. Others described unexplainable patterns in the pixel layouts, arrangements that seemed random at first, but then resolved into recognizable shapes and images. Some players reported seeing entire cities or villages rendered in the crude pixel art, structures and streets and buildings that had no business being in a simple apple-collecting game. Every description was different. No two people seemed to see the same things. But there was one detail that kept coming up in report after report, one element that was consistent across nearly every account. Multiple people described a shadowy figure that appeared on screen after they had been playing for a while. It was dark, featureless, just a vaguely human-shaped collection of dark pixels that would show up somewhere in the frame and then disappear. Nobody could explain what triggered it. Nobody could explain what it was supposed to represent. But everyone who played long enough seemed to see it eventually. The article said that the game's production was halted only 1 week after its release, and all remaining copies were recalled from stores. There had only been a few hundred units sold in the United States before the recall, and the game never received an international release. The company that made it went under shortly afterward, and whatever records they had kept about the development process were either destroyed or lost. I sat there staring at my screen for a long time after reading that. I did not remember any of these strange things happening when I played the game as a kid, but I had also been 6 years old and probably would not have noticed or understood anything unusual, even if it had appeared on screen. Kids that age do not analyze what they are looking at. They just play. I decided I wanted to check it out for myself. I went online and started searching for the game. I tried every torrent site I knew of, every ROM archive, every retro gaming forum, and database. Nothing. The game did not exist anywhere on the internet. I could not find a single download link, a single screenshot, a single forum thread discussing it. No reviews, no gameplay videos, no preservation efforts. The only evidence that the game had ever existed was that one article I had stumbled across by accident. Everything else was a complete blank, as if the game had been scrubbed from history. That bothered me more than it should have. The internet is supposed to preserve everything. There are communities dedicated to tracking down and archiving every piece of software ever created, no matter how obscure. For a game to have zero presence anywhere, not even a passing mention in a forum post from 15 years ago, felt wrong. It felt deliberate. I decided to take a different approach. I drove out to my parents' house the following weekend and asked them about the game. They did not remember it, which was not surprising. They had bought me dozens of cartridges over the years, and the Orchard had apparently not made enough of an impression on anyone to stick in their memory. But they told me I was welcome to look through the basement if I wanted. Their basement was exactly the way I remembered it. Cluttered, dusty, packed with decades of accumulated stuff that nobody had gotten around to throwing away. Old toys, broken furniture, boxes of clothes, stacks of magazines. I spent about an hour digging through everything, moving boxes, opening containers, checking every shelf and corner. I was about to give up when I found it. My old Atari 2600 was sitting in a cardboard box underneath a pile of board games. I pulled it out carefully and checked it over. It looked like it was in decent shape for something that had been sitting in a basement for over 30 years. And underneath the console, at the bottom of the box, was the cartridge, the Orchard. The label was faded and slightly peeling, but I could still read the title. I held it in my hands and felt that same distant flicker of recognition. I brought everything home. The console needed a proper adapter to connect to my modern television, which required a trip to an electronics store and about 45 minutes of research online to figure out which cable I actually needed. But I got it sorted eventually, hooked everything up, plugged in the cartridge, and turned it on. The game was bad. That was my first and most immediate impression. The graphics were terrible even by Atari 2600 standards, blocky and muddy and barely legible. The music, if you could call it that, was just a single droning sound that played continuously in the background, never changing, never resolving into anything recognizable as a melody. It was not music. It was noise, this flat, grinding, repetitive tone that sat in your ears and refused to leave. Within the first 10 minutes, I understood why I had forgotten about this game. There was nothing here worth remembering. The gameplay was exactly what the article had described. You moved your little farmer around a forest full of trees, you collected apples that appeared on the ground, and you dodged birds that flew across the screen at irregular intervals. That was it. There was no score screen that I could find, no level transitions, no indication of progress. Just the forest and the apples and the birds, going on and on and on. I played for about 2 hours. I collected apples. I dodged birds. Nothing interesting happened. And I was getting incredibly bored. I almost turned it off several times, but something kept me going. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was curiosity about whether the strange things described in the article would actually appear. Maybe it was that droning sound, which had somehow stopped being annoying and started becoming almost hypnotic, settling into the background of my awareness like white noise. Then I started to notice something. The level I was on was dense with apple trees, more than I had seen in the earlier parts of the game. They were arranged in a specific pattern, clusters and gaps and rows that at first seemed random. But the longer I looked at it, the more familiar the layout became. I stopped moving my character and just stared at the screen, and slowly the recognition solidified. The arrangement of trees matched the floor plan of my childhood home. I could see the outline of my old bedroom, the 2 bathrooms, my parents' room, the guest room. The proportions were not exact. This was still an Atari game, with a resolution that could barely render a circle, but the general shape was unmistakable. I told myself it was a coincidence. I told myself I was seeing patterns where none existed because the article had primed me to look for them. The human brain is wired to find familiar shapes in random noise, faces in clouds, animals in rock formations, the layout of your childhood home in a grid of pixelated trees. It is called pareidolia, and it is one of the most well-documented quirks of human perception. That was all this was. I kept playing, and as I continued moving through the forest, I saw the face of my dead grandfather. It was not rendered as a clear image. It was not a portrait or a photograph dropped into the game. It looked like just another section of the level, trees and ground and sky, but the specific arrangement of pixels formed his face, his eyes, his nose, the shape of his jaw, the way his hair used to look before he went bald. It was him. I recognized him instantly and completely, the way you recognize a family member across a crowded room. That strange droning music was starting to get under my skin. It had not changed at all since the game started, the same flat, grinding tone, but something about it felt different now, heavier, more present, like it was not just coming from the television speakers anymore, but from somewhere closer, somewhere inside my own head. I told myself I was hallucinating. The article had planted the suggestion, and now my brain was doing exactly what brains do when they are given a framework for finding hidden things. It was confirmation bias combined with pareidolia, combined with 2 hours of staring at a flickering Atari screen in a dim room. I was seeing things because I wanted to see things, and if I turned off the game and went to bed and came back tomorrow with fresh eyes, everything would look like random noise again. But I did not turn it off. And it got worse. I saw my old cat, the one that had died when I was in high school. I saw the faces of ex-girlfriends, clear enough that I could have named each one. The pixel patterns were forming images with increasing speed and clarity, as if the game was learning how to communicate with me and getting better at it with every passing minute. Then the shadowy figure appeared. It showed up in the corner of the screen, just like the article had described. A dark, vaguely human-shaped silhouette made of clustered dark pixels, standing motionless among the trees. It was there for maybe 2 seconds, and then it was gone. But in those 2 seconds, something shifted. The images I was seeing in the pixel patterns were no longer static. They were moving. They were playing out like scenes, like short clips of video rendered in the crudest possible resolution, but somehow still perfectly comprehensible. I saw myself as a 2-year-old, sitting on the living room floor playing with a toy truck, while my mother sat on the couch behind me, knitting. I remembered that toy truck. I had not thought about it in decades, but the moment I saw it on screen, the memory came flooding back. The weight of it in my small hands, the sound the wheels made on the carpet, the particular shade of yellow it had been painted. More memories followed. I saw myself at 6 years old, sitting cross-legged in front of the television, playing this exact game on this exact console. I watched my younger self collect apples and dodge birds with the clumsy enthusiasm of a child who does not know or care that the game is bad. Then I saw myself at 7, at 8, at 9. The game was playing back my life in order, showing me moments I had lived through decades ago, some of which I remembered clearly, and some of which I had completely forgotten. Birthday parties, school days, arguments with friends, quiet afternoons reading books in my room. Each scene lasted only a few seconds before giving way to the next, but each one was accurate in ways that made my stomach drop, because these were not generic childhood scenes. These were specific. These were mine. The shadowy figure kept appearing. Every time it showed up, the scenes became more vivid and more recent. I saw my teenage years, my 20s, my 30s. I saw moments from my marriage, from jobs I had held, from apartments I had lived in. The game was not just showing me my past, it was showing me my entire life, every stage of it, compressed into flickering pixel art on a 40-year-old game console. Then it reached the present. I saw myself at 50 years old, which is what I am today. I saw myself sitting in my living room in front of my modern television with an old Atari 2600 connected to it by an adapter cable, playing a game with terrible graphics and a droning soundtrack that never changed. I was watching myself from a slight angle, as if the scene was being observed from somewhere just to my left. The detail was impossible. The shape of my furniture, the lamp on the end table, the specific way I was hunched forward in my chair. It was exact. It was now. But it was not the final memory. The scene shifted one more time. I saw myself in a body bag. The zipper was being pulled up over my face by hands I could not identify. The bag was lifted and carried to a hole in the ground, not a proper grave, not a cemetery plot, just a rough, unprofessional-looking hole, dug in what appeared to be dirt or mud in some location I did not recognize. The bag was dropped into the hole. Dirt was shoveled on top of it. The scene played out silently, just pixels rearranging themselves on a screen. But I could feel the weight of the dirt, the darkness, the finality of it. I yanked the power cable out of the console so hard it nearly pulled the television off the stand. My hands were shaking. I could still hear the droning sound even though the game was off, a residual echo bouncing around inside my skull. I grabbed the cartridge out of the console, took it to my workbench, and smashed it with a hammer. I hit it over and over until it was nothing but plastic shards and fragments of circuit boards scattered across the table. I wanted it destroyed. I wanted every trace of it gone. While I was standing there with the hammer in my hand, breathing hard, I looked out the window. A police car was pulling up in front of my house. I did not call the police. I had no reason to expect a visit from anyone. 2 officers got out of the car and walked toward my front door with a purpose in their step that made it very clear they were not here for a friendly chat. I did not wait to find out what they wanted. I went straight to the basement. I am in my basement right now. I can hear them upstairs, walking through the rooms, their boots heavy on the floor. They are talking to each other, but I cannot make out the words clearly. Just the low murmur of voices and the occasional burst of static from a radio. They are looking for me. I do not know what I discovered by playing that game. I do not know how a cartridge manufactured in 1982 was able to show me scenes from my life that had not happened yet at the time it was made. I do not know how it knew the layout of my childhood home, or the face of my grandfather, or what my living room looks like today. I do not know who made it, or why, or what they intended it to do. I do not know why the police are in my house right now, or what connection they have to any of this. And my single biggest regret, the one thing that is eating at me as I sit here in the dark, listening to footsteps above me, is that I smashed that cartridge instead of uploading the ROM file. I could have dumped the data, attached it to this post, and let someone else examine it. Someone smarter than me, someone with the technical skills to pull the thing apart and figure out how it worked. Instead, I panicked and destroyed the only evidence that any of this was real. If you are reading this, I do not know what to tell you. I do not know what to ask for. I just needed someone to know. If I disappear after this, if this post is the last thing I ever write, at least it exists. At least someone out there has heard the story. If you see this, please pray for me. Story 3. I should not be writing this. I know that. Every rational part of my brain is telling me to close the laptop and go to sleep and try to forget everything that happened over the past 3 days, but I cannot sleep. I have not slept properly since it happened, and every time I close my eyes, I see the mirrors, all of them lined up in that dim little room like a gallery of watching eyes. And I see Jonas's reflection reaching toward the glass, and I see Eli's face in the dark window just before he vanished. So I am writing this down instead, because I need someone to know what happened, and because putting it into words is the only thing that makes me feel even slightly tethered to reality right now. It started with a dare, which is how so many stupid decisions begin. Jonas was the one who brought it up. He had been talking about the Whitmore house for weeks, the way he always talked about things he found interesting, with this casual, unbothered confidence that made everything sound manageable and reasonable, even when it absolutely was not. The Whitmore house sits at the end of Fern Road, alone on a cracked and broken path that looks like it gave up, trying to be a road sometime in the last century. Wild grass has swallowed everything around it, and the trees that grow nearby are the kind that twist in on themselves, their branches gnarled and low, reaching toward the ground instead of the sky. The house itself is a long, slow collapse in progress. The wood is dark with rot. The paint is peeled back in long strips that curl away from the siding like dead skin, and the windows are mostly gone, just empty frames staring out at whoever is unlucky enough to be walking past. The front door was half open when we arrived, which felt less like an invitation and more like a warning, like the house was showing you its teeth. Everyone in town warns you to stay away from it. Not in a theatrical, dramatic way, not with ghost stories and urban legends. More in the way that people warn you about a bad stretch of highway or a dog that bites without growling first. Just a quiet, firm certainty that it is a place you do not go. I had heard it my whole life and never had any particular desire to test it. But Jonas dared me, and that is a thing that is very hard to walk away from when you are standing in front of 2 of your closest friends, and the dare is already hanging in the air between you. Eli was there too, and I could tell he was not fully on board. He had this expression he gets when he is not comfortable with something, but cannot quite bring himself to say no, a kind of flickering uncertainty, like a candle in a draft. But he came with us. We all went together, which is a thing I now wish more than anything had not happened. We went in through the front door, which swung inward when Jonas pushed it, the hinges making a sound like something in pain. Inside, the smell hit us immediately. Dust and decay. The deep, settled odor of a place that has been closed off from fresh air for a very long time. The floorboards creaked under every step in a way that made you acutely aware of how much weight you were putting on wood that had been sitting in moisture and neglect for decades. We moved through the ground floor carefully, flashlights cutting through the dim, checking rooms that were empty except for debris and ruin. Broken furniture, peeling wallpaper, the occasional scatter of old newspapers or broken glass. Nothing remarkable, nothing that explained the warnings or the particular dread that had been following me since we turned onto Fern Road. Then I found the basement door. It was behind a section of wallpaper in the back hallway. A large piece that had come mostly free from the wall and was hanging in a limp, sad curtain. When I pulled it aside, there was a door set into the wall behind it. Old wood, dark and swollen with moisture, with hinges that had rusted to a deep reddish brown. I called the others over, and we stood looking at it for a moment without speaking. I did not want to open it. I want to be very clear about that. Every instinct I had was telling me to put the wallpaper back and walk away and go home. But Jonas was already reaching for the handle, and when he pulled on it, the hinges groaned like something long asleep being woken against its will, and the door swung outward into the hallway, bringing with it a wave of cold, stale air that smelled like the inside of a place that had never once been warm. Behind the door was a staircase, narrow stone steps spiraling down into darkness, the kind of darkness that feels substantial, like it has weight and texture and does not want to let the light in. The walls on either side were damp stone, and when we put our hands against them to steady ourselves as we descended, the cold went right through your fingers and up into your wrists and did not let go. We went down slowly, single file, flashlight beams bouncing off the walls and the steps and the sounds from above. The wind through the broken windows, the creak of the old floorboards settling, all of it faded away as we went deeper. By the time we reached the bottom, the house above us felt like it was 100 miles away. The bottom of the stairs opened into a corridor, long and straight, stretching away in both directions into shadows that our flashlights could not fully penetrate. And before I had even taken a full step off the last stair, the smell changed. Above, the house had smelled like rot and age and neglect. Down here, it was something different, sharper, antiseptic, chemical. The specific harsh bite of old disinfectant that reminded me immediately of hospitals, of the sterile, cold quality of medical spaces. But underneath that, running beneath the chemical smell like a current beneath a river, there was something sweeter, sickly sweet, almost floral, but wrong in the way that flowers are wrong when they have been sealed in an airless space for too long and have gone from lovely to cloying to something that turns your stomach. It was a smell that made you want to breathe through your mouth, and even then you could taste it on the back of your throat. I swept my flashlight around and started to take in what was around us. Rusted hospital beds pushed against the walls, some of them still made up with mattresses that had rotted into springs and staining. Broken wheelchairs collapsed in on themselves in the corners, wheels bent, frames warped, patient charts scattered across the floor, the paper stained dark brown with age and water damage, the writing on them blurred past legibility. Fluorescent light fixtures mounted to the ceiling, most of them dark, but a few of them flickering with a pale, inconsistent light that was almost worse than pure darkness because of what it did to the shadows. It made everything move. Every time a bulb flickered, the shadows shifted, and for just a fraction of a second, you would see something in your peripheral vision that would not be there when you turned to look at it directly. The air down there felt wrong in a way that is very hard to describe. It was thick, heavier than air should be, and it had a quality to it that made me think of breathing and then immediately wish I had not thought of that. Because the idea that this air was somehow alive, that the space itself was breathing, was one that my brain latched onto and refused to let go of. Something was deeply wrong about this place. Not just abandoned, not just old and sad and neglected. Fundamentally wrong, in the way that a thing can be wrong when it exists in a way it was never meant to exist. I said we should go back. I actually said the words out loud. Jonas shrugged, which was his answer to most things, and kept walking forward. Eli's face was doing that flickering thing again, fear and fascination, trading places rapidly. And after a moment, he followed Jonas. I stood at the bottom of the stairs for a few seconds longer before I went after them, because the thought of being alone down there was worse than the thought of going deeper. We walked for what felt like a long time. The corridor seemed to extend further than it should have, further than the footprint of the house above us could possibly account for. We passed more beds, more scattered equipment. A room that might have been an operating theater once, now just a dark space with a metal table at the center, and things hanging from the ceiling that I did not look at too closely. Eventually we came to a nurse's station, a cracked wooden desk set into an alcove in the wall with a partition of frosted glass above it and empty cubbyholes behind. Jonas stopped there and pulled out his keys, and with the kind of casual vandalism that comes from not being scared enough yet, he scratched his initials into the surface of the desk. JL, deep enough to feel under your fingernail if you ran it across the marks. We kept walking, and then we found the nurse's station again. I stopped when I saw it. Jonas and Eli walked a few steps past me before they noticed I was not moving. Jonas turned around with an impatient look, and I pointed at the desk. He looked at it, and I watched the impatience drain out of his face and be replaced by something more uncertain. He walked over to the desk and looked at the surface. The initials were not there. The wood was smooth and unmarked, as if nothing had ever been carved into it. He ran his fingers over the spot where he had definitively scratched his name into the grain not 10 minutes earlier. Nothing. We went on and found the nurse's station a third time, still unmarked, still smooth, waiting for us like a patient thing that had all the time in the world. Fear is a strange thing when it is building slowly. It does not arrive all at once. It seeps in, finding the cracks in your composure and widening them gradually, until you look down and realize that what you thought was a manageable amount of worry has become something much larger and harder to contain. By the time we had found the nurse's station for the third time, I was no longer just uncomfortable. I was genuinely afraid in a deep, cold, physical way. My hands were not steady. My breathing was shallow. Every shadow in that flickering corridor felt like it was leaning toward us, and the sweet, rotten smell seemed to be getting stronger, and I could not shake the feeling that the space around us was not fixed, not stable, that the corridor was capable of rearranging itself, that we were moving through something that had its own intentions. The maze, because that is what it was, eventually led us somewhere new. A room that opened off the side of the corridor, smaller than the others, with walls that were lined floor to ceiling with mirrors. Dozens of them, different sizes and shapes, some framed and some bare, all of them mounted close together so that there was hardly any wall visible between them. They caught the light from our flashlights and threw it back in fragments, creating a fractured, disorienting brightness after the dimness of the corridor, and the reflections within reflections made the room feel much larger than it was, while simultaneously making it feel like the walls were pressing in. Every angle showed you a different version of yourself, and not all of them lined up in the way they should have. I stood in front of one of the larger mirrors near the center of the room and looked at my reflection. It looked back at me, and then it blinked, just a fraction of a second too late. Not the synchronized blink that a reflection is supposed to do, the instantaneous copy of your own movement, but a slightly delayed blink, like an echo, like something that had seen me blink and was repeating the action from memory rather than mirroring it in real time. I told myself I had imagined it. And then my reflection smiled. Not after I smiled, not in response to any expression I was making, but before. It smiled first, a slow and deliberate expression that spread across its face, while my own face was still perfectly neutral. And the smile did not look like something I would do. It looked wrong in a way that went beyond being early. It looked like something that knew things I did not know and was pleased about them. I took a step back from the mirror. I opened my mouth to say something to Jonas and Eli, to tell them we needed to leave right now, that something was very wrong with this room and we needed to get out of it immediately. But before I could get the words out, I heard Jonas make a sound. Not a word, not a sentence, just a sound, sharp and involuntary. The kind of sound you make when something bypasses your brain entirely and hits you somewhere more instinctive. I turned toward him. He was standing in front of one of the mirrors on the far wall. And he was completely still. His whole body had gone rigid, arms at his sides, flashlight hanging from his hand and pointing at the floor. He was staring into the mirror with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Jonas is not someone who shows fear easily. He is the person who shrugs when he should be worried, who keeps walking when everyone else has stopped, who dares you to do things because he genuinely does not seem to feel the weight of consequences the way most people do. But the look on his face in that moment was pure, unfiltered terror. The casual confidence was completely gone. He looked like a child, small and helpless and unable to move. I looked at the mirror he was staring into, and I saw it. His reflection was not standing still. While Jonas stood frozen, his reflection was slowly raising one hand. Not the fast, decisive movement of someone reaching for something, but a slow, deliberate, trembling motion, like the hand was fighting against something to rise, like it was moving against resistance. The arm lifted, the elbow bent, and the reflection's hand pressed itself flat against the inside of the mirror, fingers spread wide, palm against the glass. Jonas noticed it. He must have felt the wrongness of it even before he consciously registered what he was seeing, because the scream came up out of him before he had time to think, sharp and ragged and terrified, the scream of someone whose body understood danger before their mind could catch up. He stumbled backward a half step, and then the surface of the mirror changed. It did not break, did not crack, did not do any of the things that glass does when it is disturbed. It moved. The surface of it moved like the surface of water when you drop something into it, ripples spreading outward from the center, the reflection behind it distorting and then resolving and then distorting again. And Jonas was pulled into it. Not grabbed, not dragged violently. Pulled steadily and completely, his body passing through the rippling surface of the glass the way you would pass through a curtain, except that, on the other side, there was nothing. He was gone. The mirror's surface stilled and became reflective again, and it showed me the room, and it showed me Eli, and it showed me my own face white with shock, and Jonas was simply not there, in the mirror or in the room. He was gone. The silence after his scream was enormous. Eli broke first. The terror hit him like something physical, a visible impact, and he turned and ran back into the corridor. I went after him, calling his name, my flashlight swinging wildly as I ran. He was fast, faster than I expected, and the corridor was not cooperating, bending and looping in ways that meant I kept losing sight of him around turns that should not have been there. Then I heard him stop. The sound of his running feet just ceased mid-stride, and I rounded a corner and found him standing completely still in the middle of the corridor, staring at the wall. There was a window set into the wall at the end of the hallway, small and dark. Not a mirror, just a window, the kind you might find in a wall between two rooms in a hospital, so staff could see into a ward without going through the door. The glass was dark, not reflecting anything, or at least nothing I could see. But Eli was staring into it with the same frozen, wide-eyed stillness that Jonas had had in front of his mirror. He whispered a name. He said, Mara, quiet and certain. The way you say a name when you are sure of who you are looking at. Mara is his younger sister. She has been dead for 2 years. He said her name like she was standing right there on the other side of that dark glass, waiting for him. I looked at the window. I could not see anything in it. Not Eli's reflection, not mine, not any figure or shape or shadow that could be mistaken for a person. Just dark glass. I turned back to tell him there was nothing there, that we needed to keep moving, that we needed to get out. Eli was gone. The corridor was empty. I was alone. What happened next is something I have gone over and over in my mind, trying to reconstruct it, because my memory of it is not clean or linear. It is fragmented, full of gaps, like a film with frames missing. I know that I ran. I know that I stumbled through corridor after corridor, past the nurse's station with its unmarked surface, past the flickering lights and the rusted beds and the scattered charts, past rooms I did not look into and doorways I did not go through. I know that I screamed for Jonas and for Eli until my throat was raw, and that the silence swallowed every sound I made as quickly as I could produce it. I know that at some point the stairs appeared in front of me, the narrow stone staircase leading back up through the dark, and I went up them without stopping, taking them 2 at a time, hands scraping against the damp stone walls on either side. I came out through the basement door and into the back hallway of the Whitmore house, and then I ran through the house and out the front door and into the cold night air, and I did not stop running until I was at the end of Fern Road. The night air hit me like a wave, cold and real and full of the sounds of wind through actual living trees, and I bent double on the cracked asphalt and tried to breathe. I called the police. I told them everything, or as much of everything as I could get out through the shaking and the gasping. They took me seriously enough to send officers to the house, and the next morning they did a full search of the property. They told me there is no basement. They said they went through every room on every floor of the Whitmore house and found nothing unusual, nothing that suggested recent entry or activity, no door behind any wallpaper, no stone staircase, no subterranean corridor with hospital beds and wheelchairs and patient charts and mirrors. They asked me if we had been drinking. They asked it in the careful, neutral tone that people use when they have already decided the answer. They told me that Jonas and Eli were likely fine, that young people go off sometimes without telling anyone, that they would file a report and follow up. They did not look at me like they believed any part of what I had told them. Jonas and Eli have not contacted anyone. Their phones go to voicemail. Their parents have not heard from them. They are gone, and the police are not looking in the right place, because the right place apparently does not exist according to anyone but me. Last night I went to bed with every light in my room on. Before I got into bed, I went into the bathroom and took the towel from the rack and threw it over the mirror above the sink, covering the glass completely. I do not know exactly what I was afraid of. I just knew I could not have an uncovered mirror in my home. Not after the room beneath that house. Not after what I had seen in the glass down there. The towel was thick and fully covered the surface, and I left the bathroom and got into bed, and eventually, somehow, fell into something that passed for sleep. When I woke up, the towel was on the floor. I lay in bed for a long moment, staring at the ceiling. Before I could make myself get up and go to the bathroom doorway, I stood there, one hand on the doorframe, and looked at the mirror. My reflection looked back at me from across the room, and for a long, still moment, everything was normal. Just me, tired and hollow-eyed and scared, reflected in a bathroom mirror on an ordinary morning. And then my reflection smiled. It smiled before I did. Half a second, maybe a full second, before my own face did anything. The same delayed, knowing, deliberate smile that I had seen in the mirror room beneath the Whitmore house. The smile of something that is not a reflection, that is only wearing the shape of one. The smile of something that watches. I stepped back from the doorway and have not gone back into the bathroom since. I am writing this because I need someone to know. I need there to be a record of what happened, something outside of my own head, something that exists in the world and cannot be revised or dismissed or explained away. Jonas and Eli went into the Whitmore house with me, and they did not come out. And wherever they are, it is somewhere that I cannot reach them. Somewhere that the police cannot find because as far as any measurable, verifiable realities is concerned, it does not exist. But it exists. I was there. I walked through those corridors and breathed that air and stood in that room full of mirrors. And the things I saw in the glass were not reflections. They were something else, something that lives behind the surface of mirrors and watches through them and waits, with a patience that nothing mortal is capable of, for the right moment to reach through. I do not know if I am free of it. That is the most honest thing I can tell you, and it is the thing that frightens me most when I am lying awake at 3 a.m. with all the lights on, and a bathroom mirror down the hall that I cannot bring myself to cover again. I escaped the house. I made it out into the night air and back to the world I recognize, but the towel ended up on the floor, and my reflection smiled before I did. And I cannot shake the feeling that getting out of that basement corridor was not the end of something, that it was the beginning, that whatever lives in those mirrors did not lose track of me when I ran up those stairs, that it has simply been patient, the way it is patient about everything, and that it is still watching, still waiting, still wearing my face in the glass and smiling its early smile, and biding its time until it decides the moment is right. If you are reading this, please believe me. I know how it sounds. I know that the words on this page describe things that should not be possible, and probably sound like the rambling of someone who has cracked under pressure, or watched too many horror movies, or needs a good long sleep. I understand why you might think that. I would have thought exactly the same thing 3 days ago. But I am asking you, as plainly and directly as I can, to believe me anyway, because Jonas and Eli are somewhere that the police cannot find, and because the reflections in mirrors are not what they appear to be, and because something is watching from behind every reflective surface, and it knows your face better than you do. Do not trust what smiles back at you from the glass. Do not trust it if the smile comes a moment too early. Do not assume that because you are looking at something that looks like you, it is you that you are seeing. And whatever you do, wherever you go, do not go to the Whitmore house at the end of Fern Road. Do not open the basement door. Do not go down the stairs. Do not follow the corridor to the room at the end. Do not look into the mirrors. I do not know if I am really free. I do not think I am. And I am terrified of what that means. Story 4. We were a group of urban explorers in the Carpathian Mountains. The The kind of idiots who break into abandoned uranium mines from the 1980s. The kind of places the military seals off with signs that say access forbidden, risk of collapse and radiation. We had cheap Geiger counters and the kind of courage that only comes from being young and a little drunk. We thought we were invincible. We thought nothing could touch us. We were wrong. Our leader was a guy who had served in the French Foreign Legion before coming back home. He was older than the rest of us, harder in ways that were difficult to describe. He had seen things that none of us could even imagine, and you could tell, just by looking at his eyes, there was something behind them that never fully relaxed. He was not the kind of man who scared easily, and that is exactly why what he said to us right before we started the descent should have been taken more seriously. We were standing at the top of the main shaft, gathered around the opening where a rusted iron ladder disappeared into the earth below. The wind was cold and carried the faint smell of damp stone and something chemical, something old. He looked at each of us, one by one, and then spoke in a calm and steady voice. "Whatever you do, don't look down. There's only darkness and echoes down there. If you look, something will look back." We laughed. Every single one of us laughed. It seemed like such a ridiculous thing to say. We were explorers. Looking down was literally part of the job. We thought he was just trying to mess with us, trying to set the mood or scare the newer members of the group. It was the kind of thing someone might say around a campfire to get a reaction. He did not laugh. He did not even smile. He just turned around and started climbing down the ladder without another word. One by one, we followed him into the dark. We had been descending for about 40 minutes. The ladder seemed to go on forever, rung after rung after rung, stretching deeper into the earth than any of us had expected. Our headlamps cast weak circles of light on the damp stone walls around us, and every now and then the beam would catch patches of a black moss-like substance clinging to the rock. If you stared at it for too long, it almost seemed to twitch, like it was reacting to the light. I told myself it was just a trick of the eye, just the way the shadows moved when your lamp wobbled on your head. But there was something about it that made my skin crawl in a way I could not quite explain. The air was heavy and wet and carried a strange mix of smells. There was the sharp metallic tang of old ore and rusted iron, and underneath it something else, something sickly sweet, like meat that had been left out in the sun for too long. It was faint at first, barely noticeable. But the deeper we went, the stronger it became. Nobody said anything about it, but I could tell from the way people were breathing through their mouths that I was not the only one who noticed. At one point, Mihai, the youngest member of our group, started breathing hard. He was just below me on the ladder, and I could hear the change in his rhythm. His breaths were coming faster and shallower, the way a person breathes when something is wrong, but they are trying to keep it together. "Guys," he said, and his voice had a slight tremor in it. "Does it feel like something is watching us?" "Shut the fuck up," the Legionnaire snapped from above us. His voice was sharp and immediate, cutting through the darkness like a blade. "And don't look down." Nobody said anything after that. We just kept climbing down in silence, the only sounds being our boots on the metal rungs and the occasional drip of water somewhere in the distance. I was third on the ladder. Below me was Mihai, and below him was nothing but pure blackness. My headlamp had not reached the bottom of the shaft in a long time. It was not just that the bottom was far away. It was more like the shaft was swallowing the light itself. The beam would leave my lamp and travel downward, but at a certain point it just stopped. It did not fade gradually the way light normally does over distance. It was more like something was absorbing it, eating it before it could reach whatever was down there. That is when the curiosity started. It was subtle at first, just a small nagging thought in the back of my mind, a whisper that I could not quite ignore. What if I just looked down for a split second? Just one quick glance to see how deep it really went. What harm could it do? It was a stupid thought, and I knew it. The Legionnaire had told us not to look. He had been serious about it in a way that left no room for interpretation. But the thought kept coming back, louder each time, like something was feeding it. I leaned slightly to the side and pointed my lamp straight down into the shaft below me. For a moment, I saw nothing, just void, empty black space stretching down into what seemed like infinity. No bottom, no walls, just nothing. Then it moved. Something massive and pale shifted in the darkness below. It was like a jointless arm, far too long and far too thick, that jerked back out of the light the instant my beam touched it. The movement was fast, but wrong. It did not move the way any living thing I had ever seen moved. There were no joints bending, no muscles flexing in any recognizable way. It was as if living flesh had twisted and folded itself into a shape that should never exist, a form that broke every rule of anatomy and physics I had ever understood. And in the middle of that mass, I saw eyes, too many of them. They were scattered across the surface without any pattern or symmetry, some large and some small, some open and staring, and others still in the process of opening, the lids peeling back slowly as if they were just becoming aware of the light. Just becoming aware of me. I froze on the ladder. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard it hurt. A cold feeling crawled up my spine like ice water being poured slowly down my back, every muscle in my body locked up. I could not move. I could not breathe. I just hung there on the rusted rungs with my hands gripping the metal so tight my knuckles turned white. "What did you see?" the Legionnaire whispered from somewhere above me. His voice was different now. The hardness was gone. What replaced it was something I'd never heard from him before. It was fear. Real fear. The kind that comes from knowing exactly what is happening because you have seen it before. "Nothing," I lied. The word came out shaky and unconvincing, and I knew he did not believe me. But it did not matter. It was already too late. From somewhere far below us came the first sound. It was a slow, wet scraping noise like fingernails being dragged across a chalkboard, but with a moist quality to it that made it infinitely worse. It sounded like something enormous dragging itself up the stone walls of the shaft. The noise echoed and bounced off the rock around us, making it impossible to tell exactly how far away it was, but it was coming from below, and it was moving upward. The ladder began to vibrate faintly, not the way it would shake if there were an earthquake or if someone were climbing it quickly. This was different. It was rhythmic, steady, like a pulse, like something alive had wrapped itself around the base of the ladder, and its heartbeat was traveling up through the metal into our hands. We started climbing faster. No one needed to say anything. No one needed to give the order. We all felt it at the same time. That primal instinct buried deep inside every human being that tells you to run. Just heavy breathing, and the clang of boots on metal rungs, and the desperate scramble of hands reaching for the next handhold. Nobody spoke. Nobody looked at each other. We just climbed. The sound from below grew clearer, closer. Sometimes it would stop for a moment, and in that brief silence the hope would flare up that maybe it had lost interest. Maybe it had gone back down. But then it would start again, and each time it resumed, it was faster than before. It was gaining on us. At one point, Mihai's headlamp slipped off his head. I heard the small clatter of it bouncing off the stone wall, then another bounce, then silence as it tumbled into the darkness below. We waited for it to hit the bottom. Instead, we heard a soft, wet sound. Not the crack of plastic hitting stone. Something else. Something organic. Like something down there had caught it. Like something had swallowed it. And then, almost immediately after, came the unmistakable crack of bones. Not the lamp breaking. Bones. Real bones being crushed and snapped by something with tremendous force. Mihai screamed. But it was not a normal scream. It was not the kind of sound a person makes when they are startled, or even when they are afraid. It was the scream of a man who feels something fundamental being ripped out from inside him. Something deeper than flesh. Something that should never be touched. It was a sound I had never heard before, and hope to never hear again for as long as I live. He looked down. I watched it happen from just above him. I saw his pupils dilate in the faint light of my headlamp, growing wider and wider until they seemed to swallow his entire eyes. The color disappeared. The whites disappeared. There was nothing left but two massive black circles staring down into the void below. "It's at my feet," he whispered. His voice was barely human anymore. It was flat and distant, like he was speaking from very far away, even though he was right there beneath me. Jesus, it has my face, but it's smiling too wide. Then he was gone. He either fell or was pulled. I honestly do not know which one it was. One second he was on the ladder below me, and the next second he was not. He vanished into the darkness, and I heard the wet thud of flesh hitting rock somewhere far below. It was a heavy, final sound. The kind of sound that tells you immediately that whatever just happened cannot be undone. And then, nothing, just silence for a moment, followed by the slow, deliberate sound of chewing. We climbed like madmen after that. Whatever restraint or composure we'd been holding on to was completely gone. It was pure animal panic now. Hands slipping on wet metal, boots kicking against rungs, the frantic gasping for air as our bodies burned through whatever energy we had left. The ladder was shaking constantly now, vibrating with that same steady pulse, but stronger, more intense. Whatever was down there was rising fast, much too fast. The Legionnaire was above me. He had been climbing steadily the whole time, faster than the rest of us, his military training kicking in even in a situation as insane as this one. But then I heard him doing something I never expected. He was muttering a prayer. It was in French, spoken quietly but urgently under his breath, and it was not any prayer I had ever heard before. The words sounded old, ancient even, like something passed down through centuries that was never meant to be written in any book. Then he stopped. Mid-word, mid-breath, he just stopped. "Don't stop," I yelled up at him. "Keep climbing, don't stop." He turned his head to look down at me, and the moment his face came into the light of my headlamp, I knew something was very wrong. His face was not his anymore. The skin hung loose on his skull, sagging and pulling downward as if invisible hands were tugging it from below. His eyes were sinking into their sockets, retreating into his head like they were being drawn backward into his brain. The structure of his face was collapsing, the bones shifting under the drooping skin in ways that made him look less and less like a human being with every passing second. "Too late," he whispered. But the voice that came out of his mouth was not his. It was deeper and slower and carried a resonance that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the walls, from the darkness below, from inside my own skull. "It saw you. Now it knows what you look like." Then he let go of the ladder. He did not fall. He did not slip. He simply opened his hands and released his grip, and his body dropped backward into the void with a calm and almost peaceful quality that made it even more horrifying. It was as if he wanted to go to it, as if whatever was down there had called to him, and he had answered willingly. I was alone on the ladder. I do not know how I kept climbing. My hands were bleeding from the rusted metal, the sharp edges of the old rungs slicing into my palms with every desperate grab. My arms felt like they were filled with concrete. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to stop, to give up, to let go. But something deeper than muscle and bone kept me moving. Some last tiny spark of survival instinct that refused to die even when everything else inside me had already surrendered to the terror. The sound was right beneath me now. I could feel it more than hear it. The wet scraping was so close that I swear I could feel the displacement of air against my legs, as if something massive was reaching for me, stretching upward, closing the final gap. And the smell. The smell was overwhelming now. Sweet and rotten and strangely intimate, like my own body's scent, but twisted into something wrong, like what I would smell like after death, like it already knew every part of me and was just waiting to collect. I reached the top of the shaft. I do not remember the last few meters. I think my body moved on pure autopilot, while my mind retreated to some dark corner where it could hide from what was happening. All I know is that suddenly there was open air above me, and my hands found the edge of the opening, and I hauled myself out screaming. Raw, uncontrolled screaming that tore my throat and echoed across the abandoned mining complex. Cold rain hit my face. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever felt. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I ran through the abandoned gallery, smashing through rotten door frames and kicking aside debris. I jumped the perimeter fences without even slowing down, the rusted chain link bending under my weight and scraping my legs as I went over. I hit the forest on the other side and just kept running, crashing through branches and stumbling over roots, running until my lungs burned so bad I thought they were going to burst inside my chest. I made it home the next day. I do not remember most of the journey. There are gaps in my memory, hours where I cannot account for where I was or what I was doing. I remember fragments, headlights on a road, the sound of my own breathing, rain. But mostly I remember nothing until I was standing in front of my apartment door with my keys in my bleeding hand. I went inside. I locked the door behind me. I drank everything I could find, and I cried. I cried for Mihai. I cried for the Legionnaire. I cried for myself. I cried because I had looked down when I was told not to, and I could not undo it. I could never undo it. But the worst part is not what happened in that mine. The worst part is what has been happening since. When I stand on my fourth-floor balcony at night and look down at the parking lot below, I feel the same thing. The exact same feeling I had on that ladder. The feeling that something's staring back up at me from the darkness between the parked cars, from the shadows that pool under the streetlights, from somewhere just beyond the reach of the dim yellow glow. It is patient. It is watching. And it knows I can feel it there. When I go down the stairs of my building and reach the basement level, I hear the scraping, that same slow, wet, dragging sound that I heard in the mine. It is faint. It is distant. But every time I hear it, it is a little bit closer than it was the time before. Last night I woke up standing at my window. I was staring straight down to the darkness between the apartment blocks. My forehead was pressed against the cold glass, and my hands were flat against the window frame. I do not remember getting out of bed. I do not remember walking to the window. I do not remember how long I had been standing there. But when I came to my senses and stepped back, I felt like I had been there for hours. My legs were stiff and my feet were numb from standing on the cold tile. And just before I pulled myself away from the glass, something whispered. It was my own voice, but deeper, slower, coming from somewhere below the window or maybe from inside my own chest. I could not tell. The words were clear and deliberate, spoken with a terrible kind of satisfaction. Curiosity won again. I do not sleep anymore. I cannot. Every time I close my eyes, I see those eyes in the dark, some still opening. I do not go out on the balcony. I keep the curtains drawn at all times. I avoid the basement. I take the elevator and press the button for my floor and stare at the wall until the doors open, never looking down at the gap between the elevator and the floor, never glancing at the dark space beneath the stairs. But I know none of it matters. I know that keeping my curtains closed and avoiding the basement and staying off the balcony is not going to save me, because it already saw me. I gave it exactly what it wanted when I pointed my lamp down into that shaft. I showed it my face. I showed it what I looked like. And now it has that information forever. It knows my face. It knows my scent. It knows the exact shape of my fear. And it is climbing. Story 5. If you have ever searched for a new apartment online, you have probably seen the option to walk through the place on your screen before you ever set foot inside it. Similar to Google Earth, you can click and drag your way through the entire apartment to get a better sense of what you are walking yourself into. It is especially useful if you live across the country and cannot afford to fly out for a visit. You can look at every room, every corner, every closet, all from the comfort of your couch. That is where I come in. It is my job to go into these apartments, tidy them up a little bit if they need it, though the tenants usually handle that for me, take several photographs of every nook and cranny, and then digitize the whole thing later through a processing software. It pays well overall, though it can be tedious work depending on the size of the building. For anyone interested in how the process actually works, the camera I use is called a Matterport. It uses powerful optical sensors and artificial intelligence to construct high-quality visuals that replicate a physical space in 3 dimensions, creating what is essentially a twin space that matches the proportions and lighting of each room down to the smallest detail. The technology was revolutionized by artificial intelligence this past year when it became able to stitch together spaces that fall outside of each individual photograph's peripheral vision. So it is less like looking at a series of still photographs and more like stepping into a digitized copy of a real physical place, as though someone had taken our reality and simply copied and pasted it onto a hard drive. The process of doing all this is easy enough once you get the hang of it, though it can take several hours just to photograph and replicate a single house, let alone an entire apartment building with multiple units. The Matterport itself is an expensive piece of equipment, but thankfully most landlords in the city are more than willing to pay top dollar to make sure they can attract new tenants and get people to move into their buildings. Most of the time, the buildings I scan are nice, or at the very least unremarkable. Nothing special, nothing alarming, just normal apartments with normal rooms and normal furniture. But every now and again, I get a building that feels off. Something about the air or the light or the way the silence sits in the hallways that makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up for reasons I cannot quite explain. Earlier this week, I was hired by a new group looking to have an old housing complex surveyed and digitized. That uneasy feeling I just described happened in full force when I visited a place called Corcoran Estates. It was a small housing facility with only 4 stories throughout the entire complex. Each floor had just one apartment. and all four of them ran parallel to the building's deteriorating staircase. The place had been built back in the 1920s, but the building's owner had never installed an elevator, so I would have to climb those old stairs the entire time I was working. It was not technically Section 8 housing, but from the outside looking in, it might as well have been. The yellow trim on the dingy concrete walls was faded and peeling, and the only thing that gave the entrance any character at all was the stained glass set into the front door, though even that was clouded over with years of grime. I am not proud to admit this, but I am a bit of an alcoholic. I arrived drunk at this job. I had been drinking before I even left my apartment that morning, and if I am being completely honest, I am drunk right now as I write this. It is the only thing keeping me from panicking. All I can do at this point is wait for the police to arrive and try to get everything down on paper, while the alcohol keeps my hands steady enough to type. If I sober up, I'm afraid I will either forget the details or lose my nerve entirely. I remember the flimsy white sign taped to the building's front entrance. It read "Welcome Home" in big red cursive letters, the kind of cheerful, rounded font you might see decorating the walls of a first-grade classroom. It made me a little sad, honestly. There was something almost sincere about it, as though the building itself knew how flawed it was and was doing its best to make you feel better about walking through its doors anyway. The lobby, if I can even call it that, was just as welcoming in its own desperate way. Dimly lit fluorescent lights hung from the ceiling above me, their constant buzzing almost oppressive against my ears, filling the small space with that low electrical hum that never lets you forget where you are. I stood face to face with the first-floor apartment door. I could hear my own breathing quicken as the heavy stench in the air hit me. It was thick and stale and chemical, like cleaning products layered over something worse, and it clung to the inside of my nose. Whoever ran this place clearly needed a deep clean. Each fluorescent light I passed under seemed to buzz even louder than the last, until I reached the door of apartment 1. This was where Mike lived. Mike was the landlord and owner of the entire property, and his apartment was right here on the ground floor. When I knocked on the door, it took Mike almost a full minute to answer. I stood there in that buzzing hallway, shifting my weight from one foot to the other, wondering if maybe he had forgotten I was coming. But then the door opened, and there he was. On first introductions, Mike seemed like a regular enough guy. He came across as a typical working stiff, the kind of man who manages his own property and fixes things around the building in his free time because he cannot afford to hire someone else to do it. He was fairly taller than me, though that is not saying much since I am only 5'6". His eyes were pale, almost washed out, and he had a narrow nose that gave his face a strangely elegant appearance. If it were not for the stained tank top he was wearing, the kind with a beer logo on it that has seen better days, you might have assumed he had more success and charm and wealth than he was letting on. I remember asking myself what a guy who looked like that was doing living in a dump like this, but I pushed the thought away. You cannot judge a man without knowing him first. "Hey, man," Mike started, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. "I really appreciate you taking the time to do this for me. It was not cheap, but I really need more tenants to move in this year, or I am going to have to sell the whole building. I know people hate landlords, but times are tough out there, even for us." "Yeah, right," I thought to myself, but I kept my mouth shut and nodded politely. Mike continued, scratching the back of his neck. "Feel free to scan my apartment last, just to get the other one out of the way first. I have tidied up the 3 apartments above me already. If you could just, do your thing and get back to me as soon as possible, that would be great." I told him that sounded fine and started gathering my equipment. I track each processed scan on my phone, so once I had gathered as much of the first floor common space as I could, I headed up to the second floor to begin working on the first empty apartment. The second floor was quiet. The apartment itself was put together in a way that reminded me of a wealthy grandparent's home, the kind of place where everything is old but well maintained, where every surface has been polished and every piece of furniture has a story behind it. The walls gleamed with fresh wallpaper, intricately designed with golden vines that seemed to hang loosely from the ceiling's cove and trail down toward the baseboards. The room itself was pale, not in a sickly or unsettling way, but in a way that felt almost lunar. It was like standing in moonlight. For such a shabby building on the outside, I was genuinely impressed by the level of detail and style that Mike had put into this unit. The apartment left me feeling a new sense of comfort about my surroundings. Maybe this job would not be so bad after all. I was about halfway through scanning the second floor when the Matterport pinged with an error message on my phone screen. Image processing incomplete. I had seen this error only a handful of times in all the months I had been doing this work. It normally popped up when a large object was obstructing the camera's view, blocking a section of the room from being fully captured. The only problem was that the Matterport had been placed in the middle of the bathroom at the time, and there was nothing in there that should have caused an issue. A single shower, a toilet, and a broad sink. That was all that needed to be scanned. I figured that whatever glare was coming off the glass shower doors must have been interfering with my equipment. I pulled up the processed image on my phone to check the scan, and what I saw made me pause. There was a distortion, a strange dark shape, and it was standing squarely inside the shower, not a smudge on the lens, not a shadow from the lighting. It was a shape, upright and still, positioned in the shower as though someone were standing in it. I scanned the bathroom several more times, adjusting the angle and the position of the camera each time, until eventually the distortion went away and the image came through clean. I remember thinking it was strange. I stared at my phone for a long moment, scrolling back through the earlier scans to see if the shape appeared in any of them, but it was gone now. I told myself it was a glitch. Equipment acts up sometimes. That is just part of the job. I packed up my things and headed for the stairs. Moving to the third floor, I felt as though I had stepped into an entirely different era of development. As I climbed the staircase, the walls of the building shifted in tone. Where the second floor had been golden and warm, this floor was bathed in an almost ethereal blue. If the second floor had felt like sunlight, this one felt like the glow of a full moon at night, cool and strange and slightly unnatural. Dark stripes folded beneath each window pane on the floor, creating sharp lines of contrast against the blue. Inside the third floor apartment, there were birds. A lot of birds, not real ones, but representations of them covering nearly every surface. Statues of birds perched on shelves and end tables. Paintings of birds hung on every wall. The entire room was covered in bird imagery from floor to ceiling, and the effect was overwhelming. It felt less like a decorated apartment and more like a shrine. As I scanned the room, one piece stood out above all the others. A large swan lamp sat on a table near the bed, its porcelain body gleaming under the soft light. Its long, curved neck stretched forward as though it were gawking at something, and its painted eyes seemed to stare down at the bed it loomed over with a strange kind of authority. It was the largest piece in its flock, and it knew it. Image processing incomplete. The error message appeared on my phone again. This time, The shadow was not in the bathroom. It was near the bed. The dark, unformed shape was splayed across the mattress, stretched out flat as though it were lying down and resting soundly. It was not standing upright like the one in the shower on the second floor. This one was horizontal, spread across the bed like a person sleeping. I felt my stomach tighten as I stared at the image on my screen. The Matterport's internal processor must have been malfunctioning, I told myself. That was the only explanation that made sense. The camera was expensive and well-maintained, but no piece of technology is perfect. I scanned the room again, and the shape remained. I scanned it a third time, and it was still there. I decided to move on. The fourth floor was different from the two apartments below it. I could tell immediately that it had been a rush job, where the second and third floors had been carefully decorated and thoughtfully designed. This one looked like an afterthought. The wallpaper was thin and poorly applied, and beneath it I could see the plaster of the walls showing through in specked, clotted patches all across the interior. The door between the hallway and the apartment was flimsy and warped, and it did not shut all the way. I pushed it closed, and it swung back open with a rasp. I pushed it again, and the same thing happened. I gave up and left it hanging ajar. The apartment itself felt haphazard and thrown together. The walls were dark, much darker than the previous two floors, and the color gave the whole space a heavy, oppressive feeling. The furniture was old ebony, almost antique, and the chairs and tables were splintered along the legs and flat tops as though they had been there for decades without anyone ever bothering to repair them. Looking toward the kitchenette, I spotted a mid-20th century stovetop that stuck out against the dark surroundings like a block of white porcelain. Bright and clean in a room that was anything but. I did not take much time to question my surroundings. I was tired, and I wanted to finish the job and collect my paycheck. I set up the Matterport and continued to scan. Image processing incomplete. This time the figure was not in the shower. It was not on the bed. It was hovering over the stovetop in the kitchenette. And unlike the previous two distortions, this one was not a single shape. It was not standing upright or lying flat. This time, the dark shape was sectioned out. It appeared in neat, separate pieces of random sizes, spread across the counter space as though something had been carefully divided up and arranged there. I stared at the image on my phone for a long time. My hands were not steady. I told myself again that it was a glitch. I told myself the processor was overheating, or the sensors were dirty, or the software needed an update. I packed up my equipment and went back downstairs. I scanned Mike's apartment last, just as he had asked. He stepped outside into the hallway while I worked, though every now and then I would catch him peeking back inside through the doorway, watching me with an eager expression on his face. His apartment was neater than I would have expected, given the state of the first-floor hallway and the general condition of the building. The walls were plain beige. The furniture was limited and basic. There were a few bowls sitting on the kitchen counter, still holding the dried-out remains of what I assumed were his minor attempts at making stir-fried rice. Much like Mike himself, the apartment was simple and unremarkable, basic, and frankly, soulless. There was nothing on the walls, no photographs, no decorations, no personality of any kind. It was as though someone lived there, but had never bothered to actually make it a home. Image processing incomplete. I looked at my phone, and this time I did not tell myself it was a glitch. There, rendered on my screen in Mike's apartment, were 3 unformed shapes, 3 distortions that the Matterport could not process, could not scan, could not explain. One was standing upright near the shower, dark and still, The same posture as the shape I had seen on the second floor. Another was splayed flat on the ground, stretched out like a body lying down, just like the one on the bed on the third floor. And the third was a collection of smaller shapes, random sizes, lined neatly across the stovetop in the kitchenette. All three of them, all in one room. Every distortion I had encountered in the apartments above was here, together in Mike's apartment. I looked up from my phone and saw Mike standing in the doorway. I saw his eyes first. I may have been woozy from the liquor, or from the stale air in the building, or from the hours I had spent climbing those old stairs, but I swear his eyes looked wrong. It was as though they were painted on, flat and pale and unblinking, like the eyes of a porcelain doll, fixed permanently in place with no life behind them at all. He was smiling, but his eyes were not. His eyes were just there, watching me, waiting. "Well," he said, his voice calm and even. "What do you see?" I left soon after. I told him the images were still processing and that I could get back to him sometime next week with the finished scans. He nodded and said that sounded fine, and I walked out of that building as fast as I could without breaking into a full run. That was 7 days ago. I have not stopped thinking about it since. Every time I close my eyes, I see those shapes on my phone screen. One standing in the shower, one lying on the bed, one divided into pieces across the countertop, and then all three of them together in Mike's apartment on the first floor. Mike sent me an email this morning. The subject line was blank, and the body of the message contained only one sentence. "You found them, did you not?" I am not sure what to make of any of this. I do not know who those shapes were, or what happened to them, or how long they have been there. All I know is that the Matterport does not lie. It does not create things that are not there. It replicates physical space exactly as it exists. Whatever those voids were, whatever the camera could not scan, they were real. They were in those rooms, and they were in Mike's apartment. I have alerted the authorities. I told them that Mike was hiding something in that building, though I could not show them proof in any traditional sense. The scans are digital. The shapes are formless. There is no photograph I can hand to a detective and say, "Look, here, this is what I saw." But whatever memories were hiding in that apartment, whatever was lingering in those rooms that the camera could detect but could not fully render, they were clearly trying to reach out. They wanted to be seen. They wanted to be found. And I think on some level, even Mike knew that. I have to go now. I have been sitting here staring at my screen for the last hour, nursing what is left of the bottle next to my keyboard and waiting for the police to call me back. My phone just buzzed. Mike followed up on his email. I am not going to open it. I am not going to respond. I am going to sit here and wait for someone with a badge and a gun to tell me what to do next, because I do not have the courage to figure this one out on my own. Whatever Mike was keeping in that building, the walls already showed me more than I ever wanted to see.